Okay, so welcome back. Today we're going to talk about what you see here, which is two different types of charts that are used very commonly in many different environments, even in Excel and different programming environments. And they are the radar chart, as you see on the left, and the polar chart. As you can imagine, they are fairly similar. However, as we'll see, it's a case of where you get more control, as in the polar chart, they can get more complicated. So we're going to take a look at C# Visual Studio Windows Forms, how to implement these two chart types, and also some examples why you would even care about these. So one example that I can give on why you might want to use that is another series of videos we're doing where we're developing an application that does aircraft tracking. And you can see here we gather signals from aircraft in the area, and we use a very simple and very inexpensive package you can get on Amazon for less than about $50 US, and includes an antenna and a tripod and some coaxial cable and a USB, what's called a dongle, which is like a USB thumb drive, and you just plug it into your computer and you can write some software that will decode all of these signals coming from the aircraft in the area, and it will print out a list of the different aircraft and their information about the altitude, speed, heading, location. And then ultimately you can take that data and do some other stuff. We did in another video where we are actually plotting the aircraft. So I encourage you to look at that. But what we're going to focus on is taking this data that we're getting from this software, and we're going to use these radar and polar charts to determine for our particular setup with our antenna, what ranges is it really good at detecting aircraft, like to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, and how many miles away can it detect aircraft at those different ranges, and we will plot those in our polar charts or our radar charts. And here is an example of what we can develop. Here we've got the detected aircraft, and it's got the call sign of the aircraft and also the distance and the bearing, which means how many degrees from the present location, with north at 0 degrees and east at 90 degrees and so on. So what this is doing, this is keeping track of the detected aircraft, the distance and bearing. And what we're doing is over here on the right, we're using a radar chart that is keeping track of, for each 10-degree increment, see here's directly north of us, directly east, south, and west. For each 10-degree increment, it's keeping track of the furthest detected aircraft in that range. Here's 270 degrees, here's 280, here's 290, and here's 300. And at 300 degrees, we've detected an aircraft that is over 120 miles away. This says actually 130 miles away. So this is a great way to chart the effectiveness of your antenna and your setup to see where is it detecting aircraft and where is it not detecting aircraft. So for example, over here in the southeast, it's really not very sensitive, or there aren't any aircraft that have been passing. Now that's just one example. There are many, many different reasons why you might want to use these, but let's go in and take a look at how we can use these in our C# Visual Studio Windows Forms application. And again, this will apply to many different applications of these charts. So now, what are the differences between radar and polar charts? Well, the first big difference is the radar chart is really, really easy to set up. And as you can imagine from the name, it's designed to simulate what you may be familiar with, which is a radar display that measures detections within a 360-degree range. And all you have to do is give it as many values as you want to chart. And here we've got like 20 values that it's charting. And what it does is it takes those 20 values and gives you a grid line for each value. So if you have 500 values, it's going to give you 500 grid lines. And you really don't have much control over the naming or the intervals of the grid lines. It's all automatic. So all you have to do is give it a bunch of values and it automatically plots. You don't have to worry about an x-axis value. It just ignores all that and it does it automatically. So very, very simple to set up. On the other hand, the polar chart can be used for many, many different other types of things. And here we can see one of the differences is the series is plotted without a filled area inside, which is different from the polar, which is a filled color inside of the series. Here it's just a line. And you can have many different series, just as you can in other charts, you can have different series. And also in the polar chart, you can control this range around the outside, which is kind of equivalent to an x-axis. The y-axis is from the center to the outside, these circular grid lines. That's the y-axis up and down, and then the x-axis is around the circle. So here you just have to worry about the y-axis values. Here you have to specify not only y-axis values, but also x-axis. So you can spread these values any way you want around this circular image. You can also have labels to tell you what the different grid lines are. Here you can't have any labels, it's all automatic. So you can do a lot of customization here with the polar chart that you can't do with the radar chart. However, as we said, if you're just doing a equivalent to what a radar chart is, like we're doing with our aircraft detection, you don't need all that. All you need is the y values, the distance, and you can pretty much in your head say, okay, well, this is 0 or 360, here's 90 degrees east, and so on. So it's basically about control. So radar charts, very simple to set up. Polar charts, we're going to have to do quite a bit of configuration to tell it how to draw the different series. So let's go in and take a look at the different charts, how we can configure them and use them in our C# Visual Studio Windows Forms application. So now let's start with the simpler radar charts, and we're in C# Visual Studio Windows Forms, and here's our application. I've also added the ability to select and show a second series of data. So we're going to have two lists of integers, one for this series, and then I click this button, it's going to add the second series, and you could add multiple series. However, keep in mind, since these are filled, you're going to have to start thinking about the alpha value of these colors, the transparency. And here what I've got is a track bar that is adjusting the alpha value of this series. So depending on how you're going to have these, you don't want to have, for example, this big red series blocking this other smaller blue series. So that's something you're going to have to keep in mind. The way this works with the radar charts is each series that you add, so when we add the second series, that appears on top of the previous series. So if you have a small series like this as the first series and a big area series as the second one, it will block that first series. So you got to keep that in mind. Then you're going to have to start thinking about alpha values. So I've got a couple controls here you're not going to need in your application, but this is just for demonstration. So let's look at the code in our C# Visual Studio Windows Forms app. So we're starting out with some very simple code. And here's my design. I've just drag and dropped a chart. I've got a label here you don't need, and I've got my track bar and the checkbox, but really all you need is the chart. Also, keep in mind that if you are using .NET as opposed to .NET Framework, as we talked about in other videos in this channel, when Microsoft moved from .NET Framework to .NET, they deprecated the chart controls. So if you're using .NET, you don't have these charts available. You're going to have to go out, and as we showed in other videos, there are replacements, open source, but it's up to you if you want to go through all that hassle. So newer is not always better. So we've got a chart control .NET Framework, and we've got system collections.generic, system drawing, and Windows Forms. So what we're doing is we're setting up a list of integers for the y values. And for the second series, we're going to call y values 1. Again, we don't need any x values like we normally do in the chart for the x-axis, because that's all done automatically. We're also going to generate a new random so that we can have random values assigned to our different series. So we've got the standard initialized component. Then we're going to configure the radar chart. I've got a separate method that's going to configure it. We'll look at that in a bit. But here we're just generating values for Series 1 and Series 2 and adding them to the y-vals and y-vals 1. So this is just, I'm using random, you can do whatever you want. I'm using some random numbers and adding it. And then once we've done that, we've already configured the chart, we've filled in the Y values for both series, and then we are setting series 1 as data bind Y with these Y values. We're not binding the next series until we need it. So we're just doing points.dataBindY, and that is going to draw the first series, the big red series on the chart. The real work is done in configuring this radar chart in this method that we've developed. So all we're going to do is, this is all we need to configure. We're just saying that series 1 and series 2 chart type is System Windows Forms Data Visualization Charting, series chart type radar. So both of those are radar charts. And then I'm clearing the legends that I don't want. And here I am setting the color of that series 1, which is the larger red series color, and I'm using from ARGB, which allows us to specify the alpha or the transparency. And I'm setting a red value, but I'm having an alpha value of only 100 as opposed to 255, which makes it fully opaque. So this is how you can adjust the opacity or the alpha of the colors of each series. And then what I'm doing is I'm just setting up the Y-axis, which is the up and down axis, and I'm setting the font. I'm just choosing Courier New Bold with a size 14, and the Y interval is 10. So you can set that, but again, the X-axis it doesn't care about. So really, this is all we need to set up the radar chart for the two series. Now, I can add the second series. I've already calculated in YVALS1 the values. So then when I do a checkbox 1 check changed operation, a event handler, if the checkbox 1 is checked, then we're just doing a data bind Y with the Y values 1, the second series. So then we're showing the second series, else we're clearing the second series. So again, very simple to set up. Here we're just choosing whether we show the second series. And here we've got the trackbar 1 scroll where I'm just changing the series 2, that small blue series, the second one. I'm changing the alpha based on the trackbar value. That's how I can change the trackbar and adjust the alpha so that you can either make it transparent or you can see part of the red, the larger red shape behind it. So really very straightforward. Again, all you have to do is deal with the Y values. You don't have to worry about X values. You don't have to set any X-axis values because they don't exist. And all you do is you just bind the data and you're all set to go. So very simple to set up a radar chart in Windows Forms. So now let's take a look at a similar thing using a polar chart. So here is our polar chart. I don't have any second series on this, and I don't have any alpha because we don't need to, because it's a line, not a full data. I'm going to specify the number of X-axis values. And again, X-axis is around the circle here. And I'm going to set up labels at 90, 180, and 270, and then plot these. So pretty straightforward, but we're going to have some setup to do that's a little bit more complicated. So again, I've just drag and drop chart, and I can, in code, I can set that as polar. In this case, I have to set up XVALs and YVALs, a list of integers. And then I've got my random number again, and I'm specifying the number of values is 36, which means the number of major grids going around the circle for every 10 degrees, and it's going to be a 360-degree circle. So 36 values of 10-degree increments, and here's the 10-degree increments. So I initialize component, then we're going to have to configure the polar chart. To set up the values, it's very similar. However, again, we have to add the X values, not just the Y values. So I'm doing an X values with the I, which is the counter, times the increment. I'm going to say every 10 degrees. I've got 36 increments, so I'm setting up the XVALs and YVALs. Now, however, one of the challenges here is, as you saw with the radar chart, it automatically sets the last value, for example, 360 degrees, at the same point as the first value, which is 0 degrees. Here we have to do it manually. And in order to do it, we have to go through and do our 36 values, but we have to add an additional value and make it the same as the first value. So the 36th value is going to be the same as the 0th value. So I have to add, after we've done 36 values, I've got to add one more to xvals, and I'm setting it the same as the xvals last plus the increment. And then we have to add that value the same as the 0th element. So we have to specify that the last value is the same as the first value so that it will connect those together. So chart1 series points.databind xy, again we have to databind x and y rather than just y. And here is the code that's going to configure the chart. So again we're going to do chart.legends.clear. We are saying the chart type is polar because when we drag and dropped it, it defaulted to bar. So we're going to set it to polar. The border width, as we talked about before, unfortunately in charts in Windows Forms, they use border width instead of the correct name, which is line width. So we want a thick line. And then we want the line color. Unfortunately, it's series.color is color.red. And that will give us this thickness of this line and color.red. So unfortunately, it's not border color, it's just color. So a little bit of confusion. And here's where we have to set the axis X and axis Y values. So we're going to say axis X minimum is 0 and the maximum is 360. So it goes 0 to 360. The label style format, since these are integers, I'm going to use a format N0, which is just integers. And I'm going to set the font for the axis X, which is the 90, 180, 270, and so on. Major grid interval is 10 degrees. And then axis X interval is 90 degrees. So the labels are going to appear every 90 degrees, but the major grids are going to be every 10 degrees. And then I can set for the y-axis, as we did before, set the font and the color of the y-axis font. So you can see it's a bit more to set up a polar chart because you've got to make, if you want these, the last value and the first value to be at the same location, you've got to deal with that. And then you've got to worry about the x-axis values. Otherwise, you can just use the radar chart. So that's about it for this one. If you're liking these videos, I encourage you to hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell notifications. But most of all, please let others know that we're here so we get some views. Really appreciate it. Otherwise, take care. Have a really good day. Thanks.